Hello, my name is Roy Culpepper. On behalf of the Group of 78, which I chair, I'd like to welcome everyone to this webinar on why the Trump era could last for 30 years. We chose to frame the topic in this rather depressing way to challenge our audience, many of whom I am sure are anticipating the defeat of Trump and the Republicans in the upcoming US elections. Even if that happens, and it might not, our panel will discuss how and why the illiberal forces that put Trump into office may remain with us for some time. But if so, will such a Trump era last 30 years? Is there no alternative, as Margaret Thatcher might have asked? Is there no silver lining? These are questions for our panelists. But before we turn it over to our panelists, permit me to say a word about the Group of 78, since some of you might be coming to us for the first time. Almost 40 years ago, a statement was issued by 78 prominent Canadians urging the government of Pierre Elliott Trudeau, Sr., to embrace an ambitious foreign policy aimed at peace, nuclear disarmament, global economic justice, and strengthen multilateral cooperation towards those ends. That statement, which led to the founding of the Group of 78, seems more relevant than ever in today's world, with increasing tensions among nuclear-armed states, widening economic inequalities, and a multilateral system under threat from the pandemic, the climate crisis, and the breakdown of international cooperation, much of it attributable to the Trump administration. For those interested in learning more about the G78's programming, I'd like to mention our upcoming annual policy conference on the future of peacekeeping in the transition to a more peaceful world, why UN peace operations are critical and need to be expanded. As with all of our events, the pandemic has necessitated adopting a virtual format this year. Instead of a 2-day in-person event, we are planning a series of 5 webinars over 2 weeks, starting on the 24th of September. Please check our website and details and please mark your calendar. Now, onto our panel. But first, I'm very sorry to say that our intended moderator, my colleague and friend Manfred Bienefeld, also the G78 vice chair, is unwell and regrets that he is unable to join us today. So I shall be stepping into Manfred's shoes as moderator. So it gives me great pleasure, very briefly, to introduce our 2 distinguished speakers. First, Jayati Ghosh is professor of economics at Jawaharlal Nehru University in Delhi. Her research interests include globalization, international trade and finance, employment patterns, macroeconomic policy, gender issues, poverty, and inequality. She has authored or edited a dozen books and around 200 scholarly articles. She has received several national and international prizes. She has advised governments in India and other countries. She is the Executive Secretary of International Development Economics Associates, or IDEAS, an international network of heterodox development economists. She has consulted for several international organizations and is a member of several international commissions. She writes regularly for the popular media, including newspapers, and she had a piece in The Guardian about a month ago on the COVID crisis in India. Robert Wade is professor of global political economy at the London School of Economics. He was awarded the Leontief Prize for advancing the frontiers of economic thought in 2008. He was an invited member of the Financial Times Economists Forum, which has been described as 50 of the world's most influential economists. A New Zealand citizen, he worked earlier at Sussex University, the World Bank, the US Congress Office of Technology Assessment, Princeton University, MIT, and Brown University. His recent publications deal with trends in global growth, poverty and income and wealth distribution, the developmental state, industrial policy, financial crises, the governance of international economic organizations like the World Bank, the IMF, and the G20, and the profession and ethics of economists. And I should announce that today Robert had a letter published in the Financial Times on issues very closely related to the subject of our panel today. So our format is going to be as follows. I'm going to invite Robert to start off with an opening commentary, and he will be followed by Jayati with her commentary and response to Robert. Then we're going to have a bit of interaction between the two of them before we go to the floor for Q&A. And if you wish to submit a question, please go to the bottom of your screen to the Q&A, click on that, and submit your question in writing. And we will be monitoring those Q&As as they come in. So without further ado, Robert, the floor is yours.
Am I unmuted now?
Yes, you're on.
Okay. So first of all, thank you to Roy Manfred, the G78. I want to begin with the Financial Times today, not just because my letter is in it, but also because Gideon Rachman has an interesting column titled "Democrats Cannot Rule Out Trump Victory." Democrats cannot rule out Trump victory. And I want to just read out a few sentences from the end of this column. Many Democrats struggle to understand how anybody could vote for Mr. Trump. They assume it must be racism or mental incapacity. But it is that very inability to summon up much sympathy or comprehension for people who are considering voting for the president that is the Democrats' biggest potential weakness. The Trump campaign will do its best to convince their core voters that they remain, in the words of Mrs. Clinton, the deplorables, a downtrodden and despised group. That strategy of resentment has worked before, indeed worked many times, and it will work many times in the future. That's my addition. It gives Mr. Trump a chance of winning again. So those ideas can really form the start of my talk, but I'll begin by addressing the 30 years question, because I have to admit that 30 years is really clickbait, but not entirely clickbait, because if you divide the post-war period into two broad eras, that is the social democratic era from the end of the Second World War to, let's say, the mid-70s, and then the neoliberal globalization era from, let's say, 1980 through till the 2010s, both those two periods were roughly between 30 and 40 years. So it's not implausible, just on the basis of that this next era is going to last, if not 30 years, then certainly a long time. We can say it will last for N decades, whatever N is. But N is certainly more than one. And I want to just read you a statement by Donald Trump in his speech to the UN, September 2018, because this statement seems to me to encapsulate what I mean by the Trump era. And he said to the UN, quote, "We reject the ideology of globalization and we embrace the doctrine of patriotism." That's really important. We reject the ideology of globalization and we embrace the doctrine of patriotism. And this is another statement which shows the spirit of the Trump era in a somewhat different way. So this statement was made by a lady at a Brexit rally in the north of England, where somebody who was in favor of remaining in the EU was talking about the great costs of Brexit to UK GDP. And a woman called out, that's your GDP, not our GDP. And that too seems to me to encapsulate one aspect of what I mean by the Trump era. And you have to contrast statements of this kind with statements that encapsulate the spirit of the preceding neoliberal globalization era. For example, a New York Times journalist at the Davos meeting in 2002 summarized what he took to be the consensus amongst the global elite at Davos in 2002. And he said, they believe that, quote, a nation that opens its economy and keeps government's role to a minimum invariably experiences more rapid economic growth and rising incomes. So that's one statement. Second statement of the neoliberal globalization era. This is Tony Blair addressing the Labour Party conference in 2005, who said, I hear people say we have to stop and debate globalization. You might as well debate whether autumn should follow summer. The character of this changing world is replete with opportunities, but those opportunities go only to those who are open, willing, and able to change. And that is striking because it comes from the leader of a party that historically represented those who benefited least from capitalist modernization. And so on. So those statements, oh, wait a second, actually, I have one more statement I would just want to read you, because this next statement is really quite something, if I can pull it up. Just a minute. This statement was made by Gus O'Donnell in 2011, and he was the senior most civil servant in the British government when he made this statement. He had earlier been the top of the Treasury, so the most civil servant in the Treasury, and he said in 2011, when I was at the Treasury, I argued for the most open door possible to immigration. I think it's my job to maximize global welfare and not national welfare. And that too, it seems to me, captures something of the spirit of the neoliberal globalization era. Well, I want to make clear right from the beginning that I think that Trump and the lady in Northern England do have a point. That is, the costs of globalization and of liberal internationalism have been systematically played down by Western elites, and especially by economists, over the past 40 years. The costs of globalization have been systematically played down. Point number one. And point number two, that Trump and the others say the remedy for these costs must go through the state. That is, the state must take actions which reduce these costs. And I think there is quite a lot of truth to those points, however much you dislike Trump and his people. So let me now elaborate a bit on what I mean by the characteristics of the Trump era. The central characteristics are a move from liberal democracy and the liberal international order towards illiberal democracy and the illiberal international order. Illiberal international order meaning towards gated globalization rather than universal globalization or managed globalization, and towards plurilateral international organizations rather than fully multilateral organizations. That is, smaller groups of like-minded states, resulting in a kind of fragmentation of international rules. So in terms of evidence of this shift, take, for example, Freedom House, the report in 2019, which finds that the world average of countries by civil and political rights has fallen in every year since 2005. So the world as a whole is becoming more illiberal in terms of political and civil rights. And if you take just the advanced countries, then say 25 or so advanced countries, then the same basic point applies. They have become increasingly illiberal rather than remaining liberal. There are some who say that the shift towards a populist authoritarian type of politics will be temporary, and in particular because as populist authoritarian leaders stay in power, then they increasingly become themselves the establishment, and so they're not able to campaign on the central proposition that they represent the real people against the establishment because they are the establishment. I find that answer, which would be, if you will, an optimistic answer, is misleading for a number of reasons. One, because the forces that fuel populist authoritarianism will remain long after Trump leaves, long after the current crop of populist authoritarians leave office. And above all, the forces that fuel this movement are, or rather is, anger on the part of social classes who are most drawn to this type of political leader, that is, those without a university degree, those in precarious employment, and especially white people who feel threatened by the growing numbers of minorities. And these people without a university degree and precarious employment and who are white, identify as white, especially comprise Trump's base, of course. So that's one reason. These forces, these classes will not just go away anytime soon. The second reason is that strongman leaders, even after they have been themselves in power perhaps for decades, they can always find scapegoats and always therefore present themselves as defenders of the real people against the scapegoats, whoever the scapegoats are. And the third reason why we're not going to see the end of this shift towards illiberal democracy anytime soon is because the knowledge which has been gained by Trump and the others, Orban and Netanyahu and Bolsonaro and all these others, the knowledge that they have gained about how to generate and mobilize anger and how to make Caudillo-style politics work even in a rule of law democracy, as Trump is doing, this knowledge will remain to be drawn upon by subsequent generations of leaders. So what I want to do is just to elaborate a few of the deep causes why I think that we are in the early years of a new era rather than a continuation of something like the neoliberal globalization era. The first deep cause is that the trends that we are witnessing now in technology and globalization have effects on the labor market of displacing labor and polarizing wages in the labor market. And the net result is to generate what I call an anger machine. That is a machine which itself generates anger on the part of large numbers of people. One particular piece of evidence comes from McKinsey Global Institute report, which says that between the years 2005, 2014, and in across 25 developed countries, two-thirds of the households were experienced either stagnant or falling real incomes during that period, 2005 to 2014. At the same time, of course, as income and wealth concentration at the top became higher and higher. And David Autor finds that in the last several years, the 13 fastest growing occupations in the United States are all low wage and precarious unemployment occupations. The first non-low wage and generally non-precarious employment comes in at number 14, and that is software developer. And I think that for several reasons, labor markets will remain polarized, both vertically and spatially, for several reasons that I won't go into now. But if that is right, and we might, by the way, come back to why I think labor markets will remain polarized, if that is right, then that provides a sort of foundation for the new Trump era. The second deep cause that I want to talk about comes from research by Peter Trubowitz, who's my colleague at LSE, and Brian Burgoon in a recent issue of Perspectives on Politics. This is a paper called The Retreat of the West, The Retreat of the West in Perspectives on Politics. And basically they look at the period from 1970 to 2017, so a long period, almost 40 years, sorry, more than 40 years, over 24 OECD countries. They look at 400 political parties, and they find that there has been, over this long period, 1970 to 2017, a growing disconnect between Western governments and their electorates, leading to a falling domestic capacity to support the West's liberal international commitments and to support liberal democracy at home. And so, given this gap that's opened up between the policies of the governing parties in these 24 OECD countries and the preferences, the shifts in the preferences of the electorates, then political entrepreneurs like Donald Trump and Boris Johnson have come riding into power by exploiting this gap between electorates and government policies. But the point that Trubowitz and Burgoon make is that today's populist backlash, as we call it, has deep roots. It goes right back to the late 1990s, after the end of the Cold War, when this gap between government policies and preferences of the electorates began to open up. The preferences of electorates have shifted in favor of, and there's a lot of evidence to support these trends, in identitarian politics, especially racial politics, in favor of more military spending, in favor of government policies which give more weight to economic security and much less weight to economic globalization, to open trade, and free investment. And finally, the preferences are in favor of national sovereignty and less government investment in multilateral organizations. In other words, the preferences of voters have moved towards more weight, more favor for increases in national power or national strength, especially military, and less importance on international partnerships between our state and other states. But then, as I said, national governments have remained committed through this period from the late 90s onwards, have remained committed to a liberal international and a liberal democracy at home kind of agenda. That's the gap that has been opening up. So the other side of this is that voter support for far left and far right, especially far right parties, has been growing. These far right parties pushing an agenda of patriotism, sovereignty, the real people, and also that's on the one hand. On the other hand, pushing an agenda of tax cuts for the wealthy, deregulation, and so on, especially on the environment. And then the third leg of the strategy is voter suppression and fraud. And I want to draw your attention to this book. This book is called Mindfuck. Mindfuck. It's by Christopher Riley, who was the whistleblower on Cambridge Analytica. And he reveals in excruciating detail the kind of techniques that the far-right parties are using to mobilize anger in the electorate. And so I've been talking about these deep changes at the level of national units, but there's also, as I said, the separate level of what's happening at the international level of the Trump era. And my basic point, just to remind you, is that a kind of fragmentation is taking place in terms of international partnerships, international organizations. Multilateralism is losing its normative power. And you can see some of the reasons. I'm just about to finish, by the way, but you can see some of the reasons in that the old tensions which drove the capitalist economies to create a multilateral order under the hegemony of the United States, that is between communists and capitalists, that as that faded away, the distinction between democracies and authoritarian governments became more important. And this same tension has been introduced into multilateral organizations, making for a big difference in interests within these organizations. And at the same time, low-income countries have become much more assertive of their views in the big international organizations, so that they are no longer operating as clients of the advanced countries. And you see the problem that this poses in terms of governance, in terms of the contrast between the G7 and the G20. If you take two rankings of countries, one ranking of countries by their per capita income and the second ranking by their total GDP, then within the G7, those two rankings of the G7 countries are closely correlated, like the correlation coefficient is of the order of 0.7. Countries that are high in total GDP are also high in GDP per capita. If you look then at the G20, which has many developing countries in it, that same correlation is not 0.7, it's more like 0.3. That is to say, there are much more diverse interests within the G20, and that makes it more difficult for the G20 to actually agree on anything. So we're in a situation of sort of gridlock at the national government level, and moving then towards regionalization rather than globalization, moving towards plurilateral, smaller groups of countries, of like-minded countries, moving away from universal international rules. We see, for example, the emergence of three blocks, the US, the EU, and China, especially in the knowledge economy, the governance of the internet, and so on. And within these three blocks, the governments are trying to use their standards which are in their block but not in other blocks, as a kind of form of protection for their own companies, their own domestic market. We see this in US trade policy, for example, and so on. And that is really what my Financial Times letter is about. So my basic point is that the deep causes which have propelled Trump and Boris Johnson and Orban and all these others to power now, I think are going to be with us for a long time. We're not going to go back to normal, and especially not if we have President Biden. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Robert, for that stimulating, in fact, very stimulating opening set of remarks. Gayatri, you come at the same set of issues from someone who's long researched development in developing countries, particularly in India, but not only in India. Does much of what Robert has had to say resonate with how you have seen things?
Yes, well, thank you. Yeah, and for those of you who are still listening and haven't, drunk your cups of poison after listening to Robert, very, very effective statement. I have to say that, the thing that kept reverberating in my head was, welcome to the third world. Unfortunately, I agree with far too much of everything that Robert has said. I think he's really nailed it in terms of describing the kinds of things that are happening in the United States, in a large part of Europe, and so on. But let's remember, authoritarian populism began in the developing world. I mean, I don't want to claim credit for it, but sure, the unfortunate fact is that there were many more of these rather vile and unpleasant leaders who have emerged. In India, for example, Mr. Modi was elected 2 years before Trump. And I remember talking to many of my American friends saying, listen, don't be so complacent that this is not going to happen to you, which unfortunately it did. And it did a very similar set of things that Robert was describing, but I want to emphasize, it did it before. It has been doing it at least for a decade now. In India, okay, maybe for us, though, the watershed year was 2014. But there are countries, Erdogan in Turkey has been around for a much longer time. A number of other countries, Duterte in the Philippines, there's been a bunch of others across the developing world. Bolsonaro, etc., are also more recent, and they're also friends with Trump, so they maybe capture more of the Western press. But we have actually experienced this for around a decade in many developing countries. And what do I mean by this? More or less the kinds of things that Robert was identifying. It is very strongly authoritarian governments led by supposedly charismatic leaders, relying on creating divisions within society. So in fact, you want to add poison into society. You want people to actually distrust one another based on certain identities, heavily based on crony capitalism and the specific rewarding of certain favored capitalist partners, combined with a very malign use of digital technology and social media. And I think these are now evident. I don't have to explain how they play out, because now in the developed world, everyone's experiencing how they play out. But these have been playing out in our countries for a while. And of course, yes, I also agree that this creates a political and social dystopia, which is still unfolding, and which maybe we haven't even begun to see the full horrors of what it can generate. So I think all of that is absolutely true, and he's right that we are in a different world. We're not in Kansas anymore, right? As the famous saying goes. But it is a different world where I wouldn't necessarily say that we're in it for that long a period. Okay, now this is then going to become a quibble about dates: 1 decade, 2 decades, 3 decades, and so on. It's not necessarily a quibble about dates. It is pointing to another more fundamental issue with this world. This, if you want to call it the Trumpian world, I could call it the modified world, or whichever kind of world we wanted, this thing that exists. Which is that it is fundamentally based on a dead economic system. It's dead. It has no dynamism. It is incapable of generating growth of a kind that it has been used to generating. Forget equity, justice, etc. I'm not even talking about those. It's actually incapable of generating growth. And that's the whole point of capitalism, right? As we know it. Accumulate, and so on. So I think this lack of dynamism, which is most evident in the developing world. Again, there is this mirage, this misconception that a lot of the dynamism is still there in developing countries. The growth rates are higher, and so on and so forth. I think we don't realize the extent to which, in fact, this particular system is no longer dynamic in most of the developing world either. Very, very substantially so. And in countries with dominantly young populations that cannot afford that lack of dynamism. So here's the first point I would like to make with maybe neoliberalism, a neoliberal world of the kind that we had known, that's over. But, in its heyday, it was dynamic. Maybe some of us didn't like the way it was dynamic. We didn't like the fact that it created a lot of inequality, that, et cetera, et cetera. But it was dynamic. It had its certain kind of what you could call exhilarationist impulse. And globalization, too, in its way, was dynamic. It generated different kinds of growth and created new types of economic activity. Some would say created new commodities, which I personally am totally against, but certainly that meant new markets, whether in intellectual property or in things that were formerly seen as public services, now known as utilities, and so on. So it had a kind of dynamism. Now you have a system which doesn't have that dynamism. And so here's my concern or issue, or maybe my shred of hope, which is that, fascism in the 20th century also created many of these unpleasant tendencies that we're talking about. But hey, they created employment. I mean, whether it was Hitler or Mussolini or the emperor in Japan or various other places, they were creating employment. And it's very hard for a political economy system to legitimize itself. And they do have to legitimize in whichever way, somehow or the other, they have to legitimize. To continue to legitimize based only on division if they are not also creating employment. So I'm going to be, shall I say, crudely materialist here and say one deep fault line of the Trump era is that it's going to be unable to create employment. Okay, now that in turn creates the second issue, if you like. And that has to do with the way capitalism has changed over this period. I mean, we've all been, just when we got used to finance capitalism, we realized that it's not finance capitalism anymore. Now it's digital capitalism, which is a whole actually different animal. It's not the same animal anymore. Why? Because you suddenly have a whole new model where consumers provide the data that become the source of profit. Unwittingly, sometimes knowingly, because they say, I don't care, I have nothing to hide, or it's more convenient. But nonetheless, it's their data, which they provide in the process of consumption, that becomes the source of profit. And that in turn means that of course, everyone sees the benefit of this is supposed to be targeted advertising. Officially, that's the reason why they want to know all about you, because they can tell you, I'm sure tomorrow, because you're based in Canada, tomorrow my feed will have something about things to do in Canada. But nonetheless, that's the most benign way in which digital capitalism works. It's the other uses of data as a source of profit are much more dangerous, scary, insidious. They are for monitoring and surveillance, they're for influencing democratic processes. Robert's already talked about that. For targeting social groups and dissenters, for using knowledge by individuals, for settling individual and group scores. And of course, they're strongly linked to authoritarian governments. There's been talk of how Facebook has been certainly has been in bed with the Indian government, but it's recently just made a number of changes in its policies with a whole range of other governments, basically because it wants to keep those in power happy, and it is perfectly fine serving the interests of power. That's also true of pretty much all the digital companies. But it also means that those authoritarian governments are doubly able to assert their control and power, the sort of Huxley style Brave New World, not the Orwellian style, but it's the Huxley style. And of course, we also know that it's the most concentrated type of capitalism we have yet experienced. If we thought finance capital was concentrated and centralized, well, this is a whole new baby because it is 360-degree control, and it is vertically and horizontally concentrated. So it's a whole new thing. Now, will this digital capitalism allow or desire the kind of gated globalization and fragmented rules that Robert was talking about? Does it suit their purpose? I mean, okay, they live with it for the time being, but is that really, I mean, let's put it this way. If you want to go back to those old James Bond movies of, world domination, that's the point, right? It's world domination. It's not domination of a little block here or a part block there and having to compete with another dominating type in that other block. So I think there is an inherent contradiction with the kind of digital capitalism that is emerging today and this regional fragmentation. From there, I think there's this other issue, and that relates to geopolitics. And I think Robert did a brilliant job of describing some of those tensions. And of course, also he's talked about it in his letter to the Financial Times today. But I think the letter, in fact, brings that out. You know, it's not just fragile externally, which is to say that this is a fragile geopolitics because there are competing interests. He says there are countries that are like-minded. I don't agree. I don't think countries are like-minded. I think there are dominant groups in particular countries that are like-minded. But in fact, hey, all those dominant groups are like-minded with each other. It's the rest of the population that varies, and the extent to which they vary, I think, will matter more and more. But it's also, because of that, there is the internal fragility of this geopolitics. And I think there we often tend to assume that, you know, everything's all right in China. And that, you know, it's just emerging, becoming stronger. But there are those who argue that the newly found and very aggressive assertion of China in its region, globally, and so on, is part of a rather complex process of internal legitimization for what is also a relatively fragile, well, perhaps not as crazy fragile as all of us are. So please, I'm not saying, by the way, that it's better, worse, or anything. I'm just saying that it's not as secure as often people would like to think. And in particular, you know, the Chinese state, I think, after Tiananmen, basically did a kind of Faustian deal with the citizenry. They basically said, we'll keep giving you more and more goodies, you keep your mouth shut. And the citizenry accepted it. Now, in fact, that's no longer possible. And we're getting a different kind of citizenry, one that has got used to a more globalized world, one that has got more dependent on that kind of global interaction, especially the young, who are now all in that, you know, adult age group, and who will be less willing to accept a trade-off, firstly, but secondly, that trade-off is no longer available to give. That kind of dramatic expansion, that transformation of living standards, that's no longer possible. Instead of that, you have, you know, housing prices that will cost you 20 lifetimes for you to actually get a flat in Beijing at your average wages, and so on and so forth. You have different sources of that inequality, and which generate a different kind of political instability. And I am not willing to believe that it's non-existent. I would argue that a lot of the external aggression is an attempt to actually direct popular sentiment into nationalist lines rather than into these other kinds of issues. So Robert's absolutely right. The angry classes will be around. Strongmen can find scapegoats, and then they can use all of this social media and digital technology, and they know how to manipulate all of that, and so on. But you know, here's the thing, and this reminds me of something my old teacher Joan Robinson used to say about India. She used to visit India quite often, and she had this wonderful sentence. She said, everything you can say about India, the opposite is also true. And I think Robert, who's been to India a lot, will also appreciate that. But you know, I think that's also true a little bit about what's happening now, which is that everything you can say right now about what's going on in the world, the opposite is also true. Because you see, and I think the pandemic, by the way, is showing this, just like the economy is showing this. In India, it's a classic example. Forgive me for raising the Indian example so much, but I think it captures it in a way. You know, here is a government that has got so used to the combination of bullying, manipulating, managing public perception, etc., that's all they know how to do. And so when something comes along that doesn't respond to that, a virus, you actually don't have a clue. You don't know what to do. You're completely at a loss about how to deal with it. You make all the stupidest kinds of mistakes. Similarly, with the economy, it responds to its own laws. You can't bash it and say, go out there and grow, you see, or you can't say you're actually growing. It's just, the numbers are lies, or we will not tell you the numbers, we'll make up some other numbers. You can't do that. There are these processes which you cannot manipulate or bully into submission. And that's the problem with authoritarian populism. It can't deal with a lot of these forces. And if we thought that these were big issues, wait till climate change, which has, by the way, already begun. In India, we're already getting climate refugees in large parts of our subcontinent and many parts of Africa and so on. So wait till climate catastrophes erupt in a bigger way, and the complete cluelessness of all of these leaders will become more evident. Now, how long can you therefore rely on the notion of the other, concepts of hatred, resentment, anger, and etc.? I think that's my question. I think, well, my assessment, if you like, which might be completely off, and I've been so off so long, is that you can't do that for very long. You can do it for 5 years, 6 years, maybe even a decade. You can't do it for longer than that. And therefore, this combination of forces that this absolutely appalling set of political leaders cannot handle, and the fact that ultimately civilization rests on cooperation, whether we like it or not. I think those two will mean that either we actually extinguish ourselves as the human race, or we get out of this. And it would have to be sooner rather than later, because if it is 3 decades, then in fact we are heading for extinction. Then we're not anymore talking about a human race at all. So I would say, final point, I'm sorry I've gone on for longer than I should have, Roy, but the final point is that there's a very interesting point that Margaret Mead made. Somebody asked, what's the first sign of civilization? And they were thinking, oh, maybe it's an instrument, a tool or something like that. She said it's a broken limb. That's, as an anthropologist or as somebody who looks at fossils, you can identify when it was civilized when you find a broken limb in a skeleton. Why? Evidence of a broken limb. Because you see, among animals, if you break a limb, you basically die. Whereas if you find a skeleton with a broken limb, that's a sign that somebody looked after that person, brought it food, ensured that it got well, took care of it until it survived. And that's when you know that that is civilization, because civilization cannot occur without cooperation. And I think ultimately humanity will realize that. So that's why I don't think it can last 30 years, because if it does, there won't be any humanity to talk about. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Jayati. Robert, I think Jayati's laid out a number of issues that basically invite your engagement. Is the new world order, as exemplified by Trump and strongman, replete not only with rationale such as you've laid out, but also weaknesses? Are they unable to deal with the existential crises of our time? And foremost among those, climate change. I'm so grateful for Jayati to bring that up. Robert.
Well, I would sooner open it up for wider discussion, but just let me remind you that Trump has recently claimed that he is the defender of world civilization, quite contrary to what Jayati just said, that he is what stands between us and oblivion. He and his type of government. I mean, that just illustrates the kind of bizarre world that we are living in, that somebody can actually say that and say it in total confidence. But I think I won't come in right now. Let's open it up to questions and comments from the other participants.
Jayati, is that okay with you? Did you have any final observations before we go to the floor?
Yes, please, let's go to the floor, yeah.
Okay, a number of people have weighed in on the Q&A line. I don't know if our panelists are tuned into that. Manfred Bienenfeld started off by, have you read Manfred's question, Robert?
No, I haven't. And I'm not quite sure how to. Where is
You have
the
to go to the Q&A. But you know, one of the questions is whether a universal basic income will solve some of your problems.
Well, shall I just comment on that?
Yes, please do.
Okay. Well, certainly, I think that that movement in that direction would be a very good idea. But you have to always remember that the universal basic income also gets strong support from some sections of the very conservative movement on grounds that with the universal basic income, practically everything else in the welfare state can be removed. And then people can spend out of their universal basic income on education, on healthcare, and on other public services without the state having to provide these. And that, of course, is a very dangerous idea, which I would reject. But it is one reason why many conservatives support a universal basic income. And then there are difficult questions about the financing of such a universal basic income, assuming that the rest of the welfare state stays in place. And there are certainly some people who say that it would be crippling financially if it was not means tested. So in that case, it would not be a universal basic income, but it would be a means tested basic income. But certainly movement in that direction, movement in a kind of embedded liberalism direction of Polanyi and John Ruggie and all those others who have written about this, I think would do a lot to remove the anger, what I call the anger machine, and that seems to me to be the kind of route, one of the routes out of this nightmare.
Jaiti, did you have anything to add to that?
Yes. You know, I think there's a lot of, I think we have to remember that the origin of the basic income was actually a very neoliberal one. It was Milton Friedman. He called it a negative income tax. And his whole idea was that you have a positive income tax, and at a certain slab of income, you actually start a negative income tax, which is that you get money from the state rather than elsewhere. But he wanted it essentially without, as Robert put it, all the other trappings of the welfare state. In other words, he felt that the state should get out of public services and you give this basic income and let people choose what they're going to do with it. And if they want healthcare, they do that. If they want to educate their kids, they do that, and so on. That's my fear. And in fact, the way it's being pushed in the developing world is precisely that. It is by cutting down on universal public services and instead providing income. And so I think that's terrible for me. I mean, in other words, any basic income will have to come on top of universal good quality basic services. So that's number one, and that is not how it's presented in the developing world, unfortunately. So when it's pushed in the developing world, it's a substitute for public services rather than an addition. The other thing is that, you know, I think we forget about the idea of the dignity of work. So there is one reason why I personally prefer employment schemes, and employment schemes of all kinds. I mean, it doesn't have to be very hard, rigid manual labor and etc. It can be in the care services, it can be creative industries, it can be a whole range of activities. But employment schemes actually do give a sense of dignity of labor. They don't give a sense of handout. The minute you get the targeted basic income, then you get all of the other kind of social stigma, you get differentiation, you get all of the other kinds of things that are associated with people feeling that, you know, some are just sitting there, you know, collecting money for doing nothing. Having said that, there's one area which is generally not considered adequately, and that's unpaid care services, which are dominantly delivered by women in households and which are typically unrewarded. And so people have argued that there is a case for basic income in such situations. Whereas I would argue that what there is a case for is recognizing, redistributing, and rewarding care work rather than allowing it to continue in unpaid form by women within households, which is fundamentally, undermines both the economic and social position of the woman, but also relies on all these notions of, motherhood and care, loving and women and so on and so forth, to actually push this major burden of social reproduction onto women. So I think the basic income thing is a complicated one. I'm not an advocate for it universally without looking at the conditions and specifically whether it's coming as an addition or not. And you will find in all developing countries, it's never coming as an addition for the reasons that Robert mentioned, that it's seen as too expensive.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jayati. Can I come back to this huge issue of climate change that Jayati raised in her concluding comments? If the Trump era is going to last 3 decades or more, and if nothing is done about the climate emergency, aren't we all doomed to extinction? I mean, we just don't have 3 decades. Robert?
I think I'll just sidestep that one. I mean, I don't have a clear answer to it.
Okay.
So, I think that it is urgent. I completely agree. And I think we don't even realize how urgent it is because it's not something in the future anymore. It's actually happening in many parts of the world without adequate publicity being given to it. And I think it has to be, there's a lot of talk about a global Green New Deal, which has, talked about how you need international cooperation for major public investments that will deal with both mitigation and adaptation for the climate. And the trouble is that a lot of that appears to be dead in the water because basically none of the important global leaders is taking it seriously. And if the pandemic reaction is any indication, then it's actually set back the whole problem or issue of dealing with the climate because the most fossil fuel projects, the most carbon emitting projects, because they're desperate somehow to get economic activity going, whatever happens. By the way, my internet connection is weak. I hope you can hear me. I've just been told.
We did lose you for some time. We did lose you for a short time.
15 seconds.
Okay. Oh, okay. So basically what I'm saying is that the climate catastrophe is actually already upon us. We are beginning to see some of the signs of it, and it's going to get much, much worse. It can be resolved by a global Green New Deal. I would argue it has to be a multicolored New Deal, not just green, but it has to be purple for looking at the care economy and health and so on. It has to be red because it has to generate more equality. It has to be blue because we are forgetting about water and the crucial, erosion of water and potable water in many parts of the world and the desecration of even the oceans. And so, yes, it has to do all of these things if we have to save the planet and save humanity and so on and so forth. These are very big words and they seem undoable because they seem so big. But again, I go back to the point that, change often happens when we don't expect it. And it comes from directions where we're not looking. And I, again, believe that humanity will actually step back from the brink. So maybe it won't come in the form that we are expecting, that there'll be this nice coordinated movement, there'll be a nice meeting in Paris and everybody will agree and whoever is president, Trump or Biden, and everybody else will come and sign this little thing. Maybe it won't happen that way. But there will be pressures that are strong enough to force societies to undertake measures that actually do address climate in some major and critical ways. I mean, otherwise, literally, we won't be here, right? As I said, so.
Another issue that poses the same kinds of existential questions has been raised by Manfred, and he raises the issue of the risk of war. We've seen considerable backtracking by the US lately from a program of disarmament and disengagement and rearmament instead. Is this something that I mean, neither of you have actually mentioned this in your remarks. This is something that must be taken much more seriously and hasn't been included in the discussion so far.
Let me just come in. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Well, just remember that voter preferences across the 24 OECD countries have been moving for a long time in favor of more military spending. In other words, boosting national power as an important part of boosting national sovereignty. So this is part of the whole kind of nationalist agenda that voters increasingly have supported, and ever since the late 90s, since the end of the Cold War. And so, and military spending has been going up in these countries, and that in itself, you might argue, would make war more likely rather than less likely.
Yes, I'm afraid I have to agree. I think, I mean, and the thing is, again, like a lot of these world wars, they can start in places where people don't expect them. I think it's interesting to me that China has been so aggressive on all its borders, at the same time that it's actually engaged in this, proxy trade and technology war with the US and so on. It's interesting that there are parts of Africa which are already in conflict, which are not being talked about, which are in quite, basically, I mean, a thin line between war, civil war, and other kinds of conflict, and so on. So I think the possibilities of war are greater than ever before. I think this is always the first choice of leaders who have no other options. And it's the biggest distraction of all, because, once you have a war with some other country, then all hands on board to fight that war. Nobody's then asking, did you deal with the virus? Did you deal with this? Did you deal with that? Are you dealing with the floods that are ravaging the country? Everybody's focused on winning that war. So yes, I think that tendency is greater than ever. We cannot discount it at all. By the way, Robert, there's a lot of questions about your comment about Biden. I think you better elaborate on that.
One from Ed Broadbent. Robert?
Sorry, what is the question?
The question is about how you said Biden is not going to end the Trump era.
Well, yeah, and that is because I'm not tying the Trump era to Donald Trump or to the United States. My basic point is that this movement that I've been describing, to which I've reluctantly given the name the Trump era, it's strange to put his name on an era when he's at least the second worst president in US history. But the Trump era is much beyond the United States. It's a much broader movement. And Biden might push back somewhat against these forces, but there's a very great limit on what can be done to move in the direction of embedded liberalism, which would help to draw down the anger machine that I described, the polarization of labor markets, for example, the concentration of income right up at the top. Do you really think that Biden is going to do much to reduce the concentration of income and wealth up at the top of the US income distribution? I think not.
But at the same token, would there be more space for a genuinely social democratic party with an employment program and social welfare very much in its sights than under, say, a Biden-Harris ticket? It just struck me that given what's happened with COVID and the importance of government and state action in fighting the pandemic, surely there's a lesson. Can this be transposed to economic policy writ large in the way that it was in the immediate post-war generation?
Well, remember, we have to always remember, In the context of the COVID crisis, all kinds of proposals for Green New Deals, Blue New Deals, radical reforms of capitalism have come out of the starting gates like racehorses. And what is very striking to me is how little attention is given to the agency question. That is the question of what forces, what agents are plausibly going to run with these proposals and have a chance to actually get them implemented. It seems to me that the neoliberal movement, as it developed before the Second World War and then after the Second World War, and then really became ascendant in terms of Western politics, and through Western politics, through Western international organizations like the World Bank and the IMF, then became ascendant in much of the developing world. Those forces remain very strong, and they are committed, above all else, committed to free capital mobility. That is, to allow Western capital to move around the world in search of cheap labor, cheap environment, cheap everything. And they will be pushing very hard to keep that freedom in particular. And so the question is, how will they try and reconcile the sort of populist authoritarian agenda with their agenda, which is the core neoliberal agenda? And that's what we might go forward with, some kind of combination of those two agendas, which would be almost certainly very damaging. And then the state will use coercive force to keep the anger down, not coercive force domestically, but also, as Jayati said, leaders will look for external aggression to divert the population. So we mustn't think that the neoliberal movement is somehow or other defeated, marginalized. It's very well organized, it's very well financed, and it will be looking above all to keep intact the freedom of capital, Western capital, to move anywhere in the world and into almost any sector. That will be its bottom line, and it can live with populist authoritarian governments domestically.
But can it do so while it leads to an erosion of jobs and job security and employment?
Exactly. Can it live with lack of dynamism? That's the point.
Well, yes, because it can get huge profits from exploiting cheap labor in the rest of the world. A researcher at the University of Hong Kong named Sean Stars has been calculating the distribution of profits between companies, between countries, in terms of 25 sectors of the world economy. And basically he finds that over quite a long period of time going back, US companies accrue by far the largest share of profits, sector by sector by sector, not in all of the 25, but in about, 70% of the 25. US companies have the biggest share of profits, and they include the high technology sectors. So they're getting these profits by exploiting this vast global labor market at the same time as not investing in the United States, not investing in ways that would benefit the US labor market. They benefit themselves by exploiting the world labor market, which gives them essentially unlimited supplies of labor. So my sense is that they can happily coexist with populist authoritarian governments. and rely on the governments to keep, in one way or another, to keep the anger down?
Through repression.
Yeah. Or diverting into external, onto external enemies.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So here I am living in one of those countries, right, where where the populist authoritarians are keeping down and providing the cheap labor and so on and so forth. And so here's the thing: there's no dynamism here either. That's the point. That particular model, what you described, that was the model of the last 30 years.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't work anymore. That's not, that has actually come up against this whole block of underconsumption, that there just you aren't generating enough consumers for all of the cheap stuff that you can generate, that you can now produce by doing this. So I'm saying that model is broken. Now, when that model is broken, then you're searching for a new model. So right now they've got the digital technology model, basically, and they've got digital capitalism. And so you've suddenly created a whole new set of markets. And this market also, it's a limited market because, okay, first it was about advertising, but you only advertise if you can finally sell your goods. So less and less will want to only targeted advertising. Then it was about control. And yes, governments want to use those instruments to control more and more, sure. But then there's a limit to how much you can simply use it for that. That's not an economically viable model. Then there's the issue of using that for social division. In other words, adding to it, serving the function that rumors played earlier in terms of creating conflict, divisions, and so on and so forth, but in a much wider. That too, it's inherently limited. It's not a, can you see this as a rolling economic model for decades? It's not. So there's a real problem today that global capitalism has. It's the old prey-predator thing. The predator's eaten too much of the prey. So now there's a problem. We know what happens biologically when you do that. Predators then start going hungry and dying off. So I think there's a fundamental fault line in global capitalism, and it has to do with that in a sense. I mean, maybe this is being, as I said, too crudely materialist, but I do believe that, you can manage it for a while, maybe a decade or so, but you can't manage it indefinitely. Or for 3 decades.
Right.
I'm just wondering, are there any other questions? I'm encouraging both of our speakers to scroll through the list.
Well, there was a question about journalism, and there was another question about intersectionality. But the journalism one, I just want to comment on because in India, we are going through this, and boy, do we envy you in the West, in the North, where you actually have a functioning media. Because at the moment, we are in this extraordinary situation where our entire mainstream media has completely caved in to the state. The only ones who dare to survive are a few brave online portals, and they operate mostly in English because the ones in the local languages, they would kill or shut them down. Yesterday, another journalist was killed. We have the highest rate of murder of journalists in the world. But I think the issue is this, that a lot of our mainstream media, partly it was taken over by large businessmen, capitalists. One man happens to own 40% of the Indian media, mainstream media directly, Mr. Ambani, who is also the richest man in India, who also owns a number of major companies, and who also is now entered the telecom and IT space in a very big way. So, he's possibly owns India, if you like. But despite that, there are still brave journalists somehow carrying on, and you wonder why. I mean, you also fear for them. My daughter is a journalist. I fear for her also. But without the media, I can tell you nothing is going to happen. And I can see already the huge difference that the absence of a functional media has done to Indian democracy in the last 6 years. How much it has destroyed the possibilities for any opposition to actually raise the issues that matter, even when they are doing so to the best of their ability, but it just simply doesn't get amplified. And I've also seen how it is still possible for individual journalists to be brave despite all the odds and to actually say what matters and to be then taken seriously because everybody knows you cannot trust the mainstream media because they're only saying, oh, you know, how great our leader is and so on. So I think the issue with journalism today is a very difficult one. There are very strong material constraints. The pandemic has again highlighted that many people are losing their jobs in the media. There are very strong editorial constraints that were much worse than they were even 5 or 10 years ago, because governments are more anxious to control and media magnates are more willing to allow themselves to, and their journalists to be controlled. And there is greater need than ever for a vibrant, strong media at a time where you think it should be all available because, you know, there's so much free internet, there's so much social media, it should all be easy. It's actually more difficult. So it's, I would say, you know, sort of, sorry to be cliched, but it's the best of times and the worst of times to be a journalist. If you are one, I have tremendous respect for you. And I recognize that you're operating in an almost impossible space. And I also recognize that without you, really, any hope of a progressive alternative is completely lost.
Okay, maybe time for one more question. Let's assume that Biden and Harris win. Let's be optimistic. How should people like us counsel them? What kinds of policies would we urge upon them to steer ship away from authoritarianism and all of the other things that have come up? What kind of advice would you give to the Democrats and to the Biden-Harris ticket?
Jayati.
Oh, hey, that's not fair. What advice would I give to? Well, I can tell you one thing that has been very bad for the rest of the world has been this complete, I mean, look, US deep state, we know that, you know, the US was never the great upholder of democratic rights of the rest of the world and so on. So recognizing all of that, the indifference, or I would say even the egging on of brazenly oppressive and aggressive moves by tin pot dictators in the rest of the world, which Mr. Trump has engaged in, I think has been a serious impediment to any kind of just outcomes in the rest of the world. So I think that would be my first request, is for heaven's sake, do not encourage these authoritarian and terrible tendencies that Mr. Trump has been encouraging. That's a very small ask. You see, I'm not asking him to change capitalism. I'm not saying, I'm a very small ask.
Well, they have to take steps to, in one way or another, reduce the resentment, the anger that I think is fueling the support for populist authoritarian leaders. And that would mean take steps in the direction of, quote, embedded liberalism. That is markets with a large amount of social supply of public goods combined with markets. So there's a whole embedded liberalism agenda that they could draw on. And at the same time, they have to roll back Trump's restrictions on environmental protection, and they have to come down pretty hard on groups espousing strong white supremacy, racist white racist supremacy. So I mean, there are a whole set of things in that general field that they could move on. And I think the question is, how much will Kamala Harris be able to push in that direction when Biden himself probably is not especially courageous in taking on all the vested interests which will oppose those moves?
Okay, I think we have time for some sum-up statements by both of you. Do you have some concluding thoughts and observations?
Well, I actually want to respond to a question from Manfred about the when he says, I was surprised to see you emphasizing the new aggressiveness of China. What I see is fierce aggressiveness from the US, which has been trying from the outset to prevent China from becoming a real competitor in high-tech digital production. And so far, very muted responses from China, which is understandable given the military forces arrayed against it. Oh, absolutely. I don't dispute that in the least. I was not thinking of the US-China dispute at all. Definitely, in that particular fight, there's no question whose side I'm on, but also who is the aggressor. It is definitely the US, which is trying to prevent China from emerging as a competitor. However, what's fascinating to me is how China has actually responded in its region. You would have thought that when you're dealing with that big fat US imperialist power out to prevent you from rising, that you would need all the fence that you can get. You wouldn't pick fights on small islands or on, sea waters or on particular bits of territory or on mountains that nobody has been in for decades and claim them as your territory on every single border. You wouldn't do that. I mean, why would you, right? Is what I would think. But this is what China has been doing over the last decade in particular. It has actually got border disputes with every single one of its neighbors, and it has upped the ante on these. And it's not just India, where at the moment there is an ongoing dispute which at any point could escalate into war. But the Philippines, Vietnam, Japan, you name it, there are these disputes. Taiwan, the aggression vis-a-vis Taiwan. So I'm saying that to me is a sign that there is something internal going on that is pushing this very, very aggressive nationalism vis-a-vis the external world in China.
Thank you. Robert, last words?
No, I don't have anything to add except that I agree with Jayati's last point.
Okay, well, let me just bring things to a close. I have to say it's been a fantastic privilege to host both of you together as you each bring rich insights from very different vantage points to this increasingly dysfunctional and chaotic world that lies before us. So thank you very much for your contributions. You've been recorded, so we have a permanent record of this discussion. And I hope we can do this again sometime in the not too distant future.
Well, thank you. It was a real pleasure to be here with you and Robert, and I really enjoyed the discussion. So thanks a lot.